All right, welcome everyone to the Tucson Amateur Astronomy Association virtual moon exploration. We're going to take about an hour or so, and we're going to explore some of the various objects on the moon. We're going to draw some faces of some familiar objects as well on the moon. We'll take a look at the far side of the moon as well, which we don't get to do very often. Well, we can't ever from the Earth, but some of the Apollo astronauts have seen the far side. We're also going to explore the locations for some of the Apollo landings. We'll talk a little bit about why the moon looks different throughout the month, the lunar cycles. And then we'll wrap up with some stories about how other cultures view the moon. So let's go ahead and get started. So here's the familiar face of the moon that we see. You can see probably three prominent features here. I'm just going to move my cursor around so you'll see kind of a little arrow. But here's some dark areas. We call these marias, which is Latin for seas. So we have lots of dark areas around here. They're kind of lower elevation, and I'll talk to you in just a minute about how they formed. We also have some of the higher elevations. These are called the lunar highlands, and so this is slightly elevated. And then as you can see, as you look around the moon, you see lots and lots of craters. Some bright ones, some big ones, small ones, because both the moon and the Earth and all the planets, especially the inner planets, went through a lot of asteroid impacts in their early formation. So those are kind of the main features that you see. So let's talk about these dark areas first. So these, like I said, these are called maria, which means seas. And what happened is when the moon was first formed, so when the Earth was young, maybe less than 100 million years old, and it was still fairly molten, it took an impact from a Mars-sized planet called Theia. And so this Theia kind of hit the moon, both of them still in their molten state. And what it caused is it caused a lot of material to be ejected out into space. And they actually eventually merged into being part of the Earth. But the material that got ejected was both from the Earth as well as from Theia. And this material, so for a short period of time, the Earth had rings. And this material went around the Earth and eventually coalesced into a couple of objects which then merged into one. And that was the moon. Now, when the moon first formed, it was only about 15,000 miles from the Earth. Now its average distance is about 235,000 miles. So it was much, much closer. If you were on the Earth then, which would be kind of hard because it's still kind of molten, you would look up and you would see a huge Earth in the night sky because it was very, very close. So the moon has slowly been drifting out over time. But because it was so close, the moon became what's called tidally locked. And what that means is that as the moon orbits around the Earth, it always shows the same face towards the same side towards the Earth. So as it orbits, it rotates at the same speed. And so all we ever see is this view of the Earth. And as a result of that, when the Earth was molten, a lot of the heat from the Earth and still the soft crust of the moon caused the Earth side view of the moon to stay pretty warm, and the opposite side, where it was exposed to deep space, would have cooled much faster. And as a result of that, it actually made the far side crust is thicker than the near side. So and that's important because shortly after the formation of the moon and the Earth, for that matter, we went through a phase of some heavy bombardment of asteroids. And we'll show a video here in just a minute that will kind of explain that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that then. But the asteroid impact that hit the Earth, or the moon in particular, it hit the Earth as well, but the asteroids that hit the moon caused this weak crust to actually fracture. And so what happened is the innards of the moon were still molten. And so the lava from inside came up through the crust and flowed out on the lowlands, or the lower elevation of the moon. And this is what you're seeing in the mares here. All this dark area. And that's why it's pretty flat, is because the lava had just kind of streamed out and flowed out from there. And so that's how the mares were formed. So here in this particular one, this one is called the Sea of Serenity. And up, get my cursor back, Sea of Serenity. This is the Sea of Tranquility. This is the Sea of Fertility, Sea of Crisis, Sea of Nectar. And then over here, we've got the Sea of Showers, this large area over here. And in and around this area right here is the Ocean of Storms. Down here, we have the Sea of Clouds. So this area kind of looks like, little clouds. I keep seeing this right here, and I don't remember if this shows up. I'm sure it does, but it almost looks like a cat, doesn't it? It's like little tufted ears and little eyeballs and a nose and little cat sitting there. Anyway, and then down in here is the Sea of Moisture. So those are the main maria that we see on the near side of the moon. The other thing I talked about is the highlands, and then in particular, the craters. As you can see here, we've got a couple of bright ones. This one right here is called Copernicus. It is named after a Polish astronomer, Nicholas Copernicus. It's about 58 miles across and about 2.5 miles deep, or about 12,500 feet deep. So that'll kind of give you a little bit of the scale. The bright craters that we're going to talk about are, the reason they're bright is because they're fairly young, and you can kind of see from here, you can see rays coming out of these guys, and that's because that's the ejecta material that comes out when the asteroid impacts and it blows the material out. As the older craters on the moon, as they age, they kind of get filled in with the dust and the darker material, and so they're not nearly as bright. If you remember, I said the moon and the earth were about 4.5 billion years old. This crater right here, the Copernicus crater, is only about 800 million years old. So that's relatively young in the scale of the moon. We also have a small young crater right here. This is called the Kepler crater. It's only about 20 miles across, but it's very well defined. And then the other bright one down here, this is called the Tycho crater. This is named after a Danish astronomer, Tycho Brahe. It's about 53 miles across and a little bit deeper than Copernicus. Tycho is about 15,700 feet deep, but it's much younger. It's only 108 million years old. So it's very, very young as far as craters go. And just to give you a sense of scale, down here just below Tycho crater, you can see a fairly decent sized crater right here. This crater, if you think about the distance from Tucson to Phoenix, is 90 miles. This crater is 90 miles across. So that's basically the distance between us and Phoenix, Tucson and Phoenix. Here's another one down here that's a little bit elongated and a little bit bigger. This is 140 miles across. So you can see pretty good scale on there. So as I mentioned, here's the different seas that we can see across the face, and here are the 3 craters that we talked about. And again, if you guys have any questions as we're going through this, feel free to type them in on the chat, and we'll try to answer them as best we can. And we do have a couple of other folks on, so they will chime in if they see any questions on the chat that you guys have. We can always go back and talk about something that we've already covered. All right, so that's the craters on the near side. Here's a view of the far side. So like I said earlier, the far side of the moon is much different than the near side. And so you can see there's very few maria, mostly craters, but you can also see down here in the bottom, you can see a huge, I'm gonna try something here, let's see. All right, so down here at the bottom, you can see a very large area that's discolored. This is called the South Pole Aitken Basin. When we show you the video here in just a minute, you'll see what happened here. But this was a huge impact on the southern pole of the moon from an object that happened shortly after the moon was formed. And so this depression is about 8 miles deep. It's about 1,600 miles across. And you can see, that ever since it was first formed, that other craters have bombarded it in the meantime. And so there's lots of other craters on there. We also, currently the US has a spacecraft orbiting the moon called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. So it's the one that's taking the pictures. Again, we can't see this side of the moon from the Earth. The only humans that have seen it in person were the Apollo astronauts. And then we do have a Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. The Chinese also have landed a lander and a small rover, I think it was, on the far side down in the basin area here. And that area down there, and that lander was called Chang'e 4, I think is what they call it. So that's the far side of the moon. Thicker crust, totally different. Here's just kind of a comparison of between the two that you can see, the near side and the far side. All right, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to start and we're going to show just a little video of the formation of the moon. So this was done by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. Or this was part of the LPL, Lunar Planetary Lab. I think it was. So here's our early moon, just after it was formed, all molten, about 4.5 billion years ago. Kill the music. There's the formation of the South Pole Aitken Basin. So a huge asteroid impacted that caused a significant depression in the moon. And then shortly after that, as some of our big planets were migrating around and everything was getting stabilized in the orbits, caused a lot of the asteroids in the middle part of the solar system to be pummeled into the inner solar system. So the moon, the Earth, Mercury, Venus all took lots and lots of hits from asteroids. But that's what caused the lava to seep up, because it fractured the crust, and that's what basically created the mare, and they call that the mare volcanism. So that happened, you know, shortly after the moon was formed. And then after that, we kind of went through another little period of asteroid impacts. It's called an intermediate cratering period. And so there's lots and lots of impacts. You know, we had these same impacts on the Earth, but our weather system and plate tectonics basically eroded most of them away. There's a few that are still around, like the meteor crater in Arizona and some of the other ones. And then this was during the time period then after that, and just recently within the last billion years is when the ray craters were formed. So those are the very young asteroid impact. I don't know if any of you remember back in the lunar eclipse in January of 2019, there was, they had captured, because somebody was doing video of the moon, and they captured an asteroid impact in the dark area of the moon. It just kind of lit it up briefly. And so the moon is still being impacted. But fortunately for both of us, that it's not a commonplace thing. All right, so let's see here. We're going to do a little drawing now. So what we're going to do is we're going to start, and if you guys happen to go to our website earlier and print out that moon activity that we had on there, and if you still want to do that, you can, or you can do it after the fact. It's at TucsonAstronomy.org, and then go to community involvement at the top, and then teacher's corner. And there's a one-page handout that has a picture of the moon, and you can draw along if you've got that. We're going to actually do 4 drawings. We're going to do the Lunar Poodle, the Man on the Moon, and the Lady in the Moon, and then we'll do the Apollo landing. All right, so let's start with the Lunar Poodle. So if you want to draw along, that's fine. If not, just follow me along. Let's see if this is, yeah, it's still pretty big. That's all right. So we're going to follow along here. We're going to draw around this Maria. Come down here. This is one of the legs of the poodle. Come back up here. We're going to come back down here. Got a little close there. Come back up here. Come around here. And then this is his little fluff ball tail. So it's kind of like a groomed poodle. So here's the face, or the head, the body, and the legs, and the tail back here. So we call that the Lunar Poodle. So that's one of them. All right, the other one we're going to do is the man on the moon. So we're going to start over here, and we're going to just kind of do a circle around this large mare. And we're going to come over here and do one through the middle of the poodle. Bet you can guess those are probably the eyes. Down here, around this dark area, and down around here, and back up here. And that would be the nose. And then down here, kind of go around these guys, and that would be the mouth. So it's not quite as prominent as the poodle is, but that's considered the face of the man in the moon. It's got two bright eyes, the nose, and the mouth. All right, and then the last one we're going to do is the lady in the moon. So we're going to start up here, kind of go around here and down around here, come back up and around here. All right, this one I'm going to draw entirely, and then we'll see if you can maybe take a guess at kind of what's what on here. I'm going down this way, kind of down in here, back and around here, down here, on this edge, and down here. So this is kind of a profile shot. So yeah, this is the hair flowing here. You've got the brow and the nose sticking out here, and the mouth, and put maybe like that. Chin, come on down here. And so that's called the lady on the moon. Now again, not quite as prominent as the man on the moon was, but still pretty good. So those are the three drawings we're going to do. Clear them out. And now let's take a little look at where the landings were. All right, so we'll start with Apollo 11. So if you remember, the poodle was over here. So Apollo 11 is pretty easy to find because it was right at the edge of the Sea of Tranquility. And this is Tranquility right here. So if you think about where his belly button would be, right down here, that is where Apollo 11 landed. So it's right at the edge of the Sea of Tranquility. And if you've seen the recordings or watched the landing live, you know, if you're some of the older folks, then you probably heard them once they landed, they called, you know, Houston Tranquility Base, the eagle has landed. So the lander was called Tranquility Base because it was on the edge of the Sea of Tranquility. All right, so that is Apollo 11. Now we're going to come over here just a little bit below Kepler's crater, kind of right down in here, right about here, is where Apollo 12 landed. Now Apollo 11 did not spend very much time on the moon. They only spent maybe a couple of hours walking around and collecting some moon rocks, and not very long at all just on the surface, because it was probably more of a proof of concept to make sure they could land, they could get out and walk around and do all the things they needed to do. With each subsequent landing, the duration got longer and longer. So Apollo 11 spent a little bit, or Apollo 12 spent a little bit more time. They were also down in the mares, in the ocean of storms down here. So these guys, both these two were down in the lower levels to try to, you know, take a look at the basalt, the lava kinds of rocks and things like that. Apollo 13, as most of you know, unfortunately didn't make it to the moon, but everybody survived fine. What happened is that they had an issue about 2/3 of the way to the moon. And so they had to give up the moon. And so they used a trajectory going around the moon to slingshot them back to Earth to save time to get them back to Earth. So they were not able to land on the moon. So the next one, and Apollo 11 was July 20th in 1969, and Apollo 12 was November 19th of the same year. Apollo 13 had launched on April 11th in 1970 and was landed back in the ocean on Earth on April 17th. Apollo 14 was kind of right down in, let's see, let me make sure I get it. And kind of right down in this area right in here. That was Apollo 14. They were on what's called the Frau Moro, so I think it was slightly elevated. It was a different formation on the surface of the moon. They landed in February of 1971. And then Apollos 15, 16, and 17, the last three, spent much longer time on the moon because they brought with them a rover. And so they were actually able to drive around and explore the different, a lot further away from the landing site. So Apollo 15 was up in this area, right about here. And it was in July of 1971. Apollo 16 was over in this highland. So these guys were doing the higher elevations. This is Apollo 16 here. That was in April of 1972. So almost a year between Apollo 15 and Apollo 16. And then Apollo 17 was December of 72. And they are right up in here in the neck area of the Lunar Poodle. So they were actually in kind of right at the edge of the two of them. So those were the Apollo landings, and I'm just gonna click over to the next slide.
Hey, Jim?
Yeah.
Before you click over, we got a question about the rabbit in the moon. And if you could point out the body of the Lunar Poodle,
Okay.
not his tail, just the body, that's the Chinese rabbit upside down, the two long parts, down to the Sea of Nectars and down to the Sea of Fertility, that's his ears. And the top part of what would be the head, the Sea of Serenity, would be the rabbit's body, head.
So this is
and there's the rabbit.
Okay.
That's the lunar rabbit, and it's called Yutu in Chinese culture. And when you were talking about Chang'e 4 on the backside, the landing craft was actually called Yutu after the rabbit, and the rover came off of it at Chang'e. And there's a third piece of the Chinese lunar legend, and that is a satellite that they have placed off the moon's surface, visible to the Earth, that they could use to relay the telemetry. And that's named after the magpies that crossed the Milky Way to unite two of the stars in the summer triangle, so they were boyfriend and girlfriend, so that they could be together one night every year. And so that's the three parts of the Chinese culture that looks at the moon. What you're seeing right there, though, is the rabbit upside down.
Cool. Oh yeah. Okay. And yeah, and that's an important point, because basically, if you're on the far side of the moon with a lander or a rover, you have no way of communicating unless you have something positioned up that has a clear line of sight of both you and the Earth to be able to do a radio relay. So yeah, that's good. Good point. All right. Let's see here. Let's go with this. So there again is just kind of a summary of the Apollo landings in relation to the craters. Any other questions that you guys saw so far on Facebook?
Just one more fact about that is that Chang'e is the goddess of the moon for the Chinese, the lunar goddess. And Yutu, the rabbit, is the one who's guarding her castle. And she spends her time moving around in space between the moon and back to the Earth. But the rabbit is the guardian of the castle, and Chang'e is the lunar goddess. And they celebrate that every September 8th.
Cool. All right, so that kind of just shows some of the faces and critters that we can see on our side, as well as the Apollo landings. So what I want to talk a little bit briefly next is the phases of the moon. So if you don't have any clouds, and you can go outside when we're done here and you look up in the daytime sky, you should be able to see an almost first quarter moon. The moon will be at first quarter tomorrow. So here's kind of the layout. And if you look here, this would be the sun, the earth. And so with the first quarter moon, the moon is, and these are obviously not to scale, the moon is off kind of perpendicular to the sun and the moon. And so what's happening is, you know, the whole one side of the moon is fully lit, but from our perspective, we can only see half of the lit part from Earth. You would have, the other half is on the far side of the moon that we can't see. And so based on that angle, and so that's why it looks like a half lit crescent as a first quarter moon. And the moon is actually at first quarter starting tomorrow. And there is, like I mentioned earlier, on our website, there is a lunar phases activity. If you want to print that out, it's a great activity to do with the kids or just to have some fun with. You can try to figure out what the phases are, but it actually, then you can go out and check out the 4 different phases. And I'm going to have the dates on each one of them. You can go out and look and just see for yourself the difference of what the moon looks like. So this is the first quarter moon, and it'll be first quarter tomorrow. A full moon is when the moon is on the far side of the earth from the sun. Now you would think that when it's over there that the earth would block the light from the moon. But the interesting thing about the moon is it's got a slightly inclined orbit. I think it's like 5 degrees. So it's not very much, but it's a little bit. And so most of the time, the moon is either above or below the plane of the earth. And so it's still fully illuminated from the sun, but it's not blocked at all. Now, occasionally, the orbit lines up to where the moon is in fact right behind the earth, and the earth is between the moon and the sun. And when that happens, that's when we have a lunar eclipse. And what you're seeing in a lunar eclipse is you're seeing the shadow of, so the light is stopped there and the light stopped there, so everything in here is in shadow. And so that's why you see some reds and oranges on the moon, is because the light is refracting through all the sunsets and sunrises on Earth, and it's reflected off on the moon. So every once in a while, I think it's probably about maybe once a year, a couple times a year, the moon goes through a lunar eclipse someplace on the Earth. All right, so that's a full moon. The full moon is going to happen on July 4th. And the other interesting thing with the full moon is that when it's full, the moon rises at sunset, is up all night, and then sets at sunrise. So it's fully lit, really bright, and it's up all night from sunset to sunrise. Third quarter or last quarter moon is just like a first quarter, except the other part of the moon is lit. So again, we're just seeing the half that's lit on our side that we have visible. And as you go through the phases, let me just back up for a second. When you're at a first quarter moon and you go to full, that means the brightness of the moon is getting more. So that crescent is waxing or getting bigger and bigger, and more of it's lit until it gets to full. Once it's full, then it starts shrinking back down. And so it's going smaller and smaller until it gets to where it's at a third quarter or last quarter, where half of it's lit from our perspective. And then it's going to keep moving around between us and the sun, getting smaller and smaller until it gets to a new moon. The new moon, we just had a new moon about a week ago. Most of the phases take 6, 7, 8 days. It just varies a little bit. The moon goes through a 29-day cycle. So that's why full moon is not always on the same date. It varies by about a day or so. It just kind of depends on how many days are in the month and things like that. So it varies just a little bit. So we just went through a new moon about a week ago, and the next new moon will be July 20th. So again, most of the time, the moon is either slightly above or below the plane of the Earth. And so it's the part that's facing the Earth is not lit at all. It's nighttime, and that's why it's new. And the backside, the far side that we can't see, is fully lit from the sun. Now, when the orbit is such that the moon gets right in between the sun and the Earth, that's when we have a solar eclipse. Solar eclipses happen about every 18 months or so, someplace on the Earth. We just had one in 2017 that went all the way across the US. The solar eclipse path, though, totality is very, very small, whereas a lunar eclipse at full moon is much more broader and much more of the population can see it. So when it's right between us, that's when we'll have a solar eclipse, and the moon basically blocks all of the sun. Now, you would think that the moon is much, much smaller than the sun, and it is. The moon is actually about a quarter of the size of the Earth. So between the Earth and the moon in relationship, the moon is huge. But in size, it's about the 5th largest in the solar system. Jupiter and Saturn have 4 of the larger moons. But because the moon is so much closer to the Earth, the relative size is the same size as the sun. So that's why it allows us to be able to block the entire path of the sun. Now, every once in a while, because the moon's orbit is a little elliptical, it's off a little bit. And so sometimes it's very close, or a lot closer, like maybe about 220,000 miles close, from the Earth. Sometimes it's much farther away. It can go out to about 250,000. So when it's farther away from the Earth, well, then it's not as big to us. And so it doesn't completely cover the sun. And so sometimes you'll hear the term annular eclipse. And that's still an eclipse of the sun. It's right in between us, but it happens when the new moon of the moon is farthest away, and it doesn't quite cover all the sun. So you have just a small little ring around the moon. So you can still see part of the sun. That's an annual eclipse. You need to wear solar glasses or have some sort of protection the entire time. Anytime you're looking at an eclipse when it's not totally covered, 100% totality, you need to have protection on. And then only for that short duration that it's total, you can take your solar glasses off. But you got to make sure you put them back on before it gets out of being an eclipse again. All right, so that is kind of the lunar cycle. So if you get an opportunity, and sometimes it's challenging, like the next new moon is July 20th. So on July 21st, there's going to be just a small little crescent, probably about 10 to 12 degrees above the sun. So as soon as the sun sets, sometimes it's kind of fun. You have to be careful so that the sun has totally set to try to find that little crescent. Most of the time, you can't find it until a 2-day-old moon. Then you're going to see just a very small crescent with binoculars, and it'll be probably about 20 degrees, 25 degrees above the horizon from the sun. Okay, so that's kind of the lunar phases. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Jim O'Connor, and he's going to talk a little bit about some stories and cultures. Go ahead, Jim, and grab the screen.
Hi, I'm Jim O'Connor, and what we've been doing up till now is looking at what we see in the moon and what the moon looks like to us. We're going to take a look at how other cultures might look at the moon. We've already talked a bit about the Chinese and Chang'e being the goddess of the moon, and that's her rabbit making it guarding her palace there. We're going to go a little bit differently into another group of cultures. Why do we look at it? Why do we human beings study nature? And it's because humans are curious about their surroundings. They want to understand how things became what they see and how to live within it. Let's take a look at one group of people and how they see the moon. Compare our knowledge with the Native American or so-called First Nations view. We have Native American lore available to us, but there's a problem. And the problem is that there is little or no existing information, written information. Learning tribal lore can be like a game of telephone because their stories, even within the tribe, can drift from just from location to location or across history as it's orally translated. But common to Native American cultures and thinking is that there is a life force that flows from a single creator through all living things. And the culture might call it the Great Spirit, the Great Creator, the Great Mystery, the Maker, or the Earth Maker, or the Great Invisible One. It almost varies from tribe to tribe. But it still means that there is one creator. And Native Americans respect and communicate with his creations. Myths, stories, and other ways of relating nature convey the values for their people, moral lessons, rules of conduct, how they should behave, and life event timing, all out of what they see out of nature. Most of the time, duty and purpose for their activities are written in the sky. The sky and the earth are their life. In his book, the Spirits of the Earth, a guide to Native American nature symbols, stories, and ceremonies by Bobby Lake Tom, a medicine man and healer for several California tribes that he was descended from, some important lessons come out. First, among Native American cultures, all living things are tied together by a life force that flows from their creator. And that's what we call nature. Nature communicates with humans, and humans have the opportunity to understand and speak nature's language. The people communicate with nature through prayers, talks, singing, celebrations, dancing, meditating, offerings of food or other gifts, many different ways that they communicate through this life force to the creator. And nature communicates back with signs and symbols that we can experience in the environment around us. This translates to a set of core ideas. First, nature is talking to us, but we have to be ready to hear in order to learn. Nature is showing us things. We have to be prepared to see and keep our eyes open about it. And nature's giving us lessons. We have to keep open minds to learn from what nature is actually trying to show us. And that makes us think about some questions about this. And I'm not going to ask you to answer them in the chat. I'm just going to go run through them and see what the questions and answers could be. Should we keep our eyes and ears and minds open so we can study and learn nature? Well, sure, it's the only way we can learn what we need to know from nature. Is there one right answer we can learn from nature that is shared with us? Well, sometimes, but our impression of what we see is our own impression, and it leads us to alternative points of view that we can share with each other, but which may not be the only story to be told. These guidelines, actually, of keeping our eyes, ears, and minds open are exactly how scientists learn about the universe. They keep learning. They see what's new, and they keep their minds open to possibly change their ideas. Let's see what the Navajo, who call themselves within their own language, the Dene, or the people, apply these ideas. Not all the Navajo use that term Dene directly. They still call themselves Navajo. Some do, but that's the group name of the tribe as the people. In the beginning, the Earth Maker was slowly bringing into existence his next creation, the Dene. The world was all dark for the Navajo, where we all live today. There was only 4 dim lights that could be seen on the points of the horizon. Eventually, those points will become the 4 sacred mountains of the Navajo. But they had to crawl in the dark and try to make their way around their surroundings in the darkness, but it was too dark to really see their way. The Navajo needed a source of light for day and for night. Since at that time there was no light and they were crawling around, we could tell there were many types of birds and other animals they could hear. One of the Navajo found a large crystal and split it into 2 equal parts and started to polish it. They polished it with pollen, and it began to shine and get very hot and give off light. So, taking the feathers from 4 special birds, they made a holder for the polished jewel, and that allowed them to carry it up to the sky, and a special young man was chosen to carry that light as far as he could into the sky so that the whole area around them would be lit up. Well, the east wind was the leader of all the winds, and he insisted that the new sun had to start in the east horizon. So the young man flew it to the east, but he couldn't control the sun. He wasn't strong enough. The Earth Maker knew that eagles control their flight path very well, and they use their tails. So he gave the boy 10 eagle tail feathers to attach to the sun and use to steer it, and it began to follow its course. The young man, the brave young man, has forever carried the sun along that path ever since the beginning of creation. Okay, let's try some more questions. Why did the Navajo legend have the crystal split into 2 equal pieces? Well, they had learned from nature signs that the sun and the moon were about the same size. So when they made up this story, they made up the concept that both items that would make the sun and the moon had to be about the same size. What sign from nature did the Navajo see that told them where the sun's movement should start each day? Well, they knew that the sun rose in the east. So when they wrote their story, they had the east wind demand that the sun start there. Okay, it's still dark at night. Well, the Dene picked up the remaining crystal, made it flat and round, and polished it and added bird feathers to it. An elderly wise man volunteered to carry it to the east sky. And when it got there, the Earth Maker installed the 12 eagle feathers for him so he could control it. But something unexpected happened. The old man was not strong enough to actually carry the moon. Oh, what were they going to do? Well, the Earth's east wind decided it would help out and blew strongly to help. But it also moved the eagle feathers in front of the old man's eyes so he could not see where he was going. So ever since, he's been looking around to find his way, but he can't see where he's pointing. The shiny surface changes every day. Even at full moon, he can't see that he is facing the earth because of the eagle feathers that are in his eye. Navajo astronomy connects the sky with every aspect of daily life. The moon is a regulator of the calendar, birth and life cycles, weather, ceremonial functions, behavior influences. The meaning of the moon is connected to the life cycles of all living things. So it's interesting to see what we can learn from the moon as the Navajo see it. As part of their view of the order of things, you can see there's the first crescent, just before the setting sun. Now, if you ever study other cultures, and you can study Arabic cultures or Hebrew cultures, that would be called Hillel, the first visible crescent. But the Navajo call it Dahida, the first crescent moon visible after the new moon. However, they have names for all 29 nights of the lunar cycle, so they know how to track through the month, and they have observers. They have tribal leaders that watch the moon every day just to see what they're supposed to do, where are they on their calendar. So if we look about how things have come about, how did they, a Navajo, think that the moon was changing phases? And the reason they put in their story was the wise man who carried it is lost and he's looking for his path. Well, why did the Dene think that the moon had the dark patches? Well, they had to explain it somehow. So in their story, they put in the fact about the feathers and the east wind blowing the moon. And they're in the wise man's eyes and cause shadows. The big question is, are these shadows really caused by eagle feathers? Well, we heard earlier that the Greeks and the Latins looked at those areas and called them Maria, or the seas. And we now know that they are due to early in the life of the moon, meteors impacting, causing the melted rock causing the surface rock to crack and leak melted rock from the still molten inner moon. So this lets us come up with the thought, how did the Navajo follow the ideas that humans should keep their eyes, ears, and minds open to understand what nature wants them to know? And it's right there in the comparison of the two objects. They observed how the sun and the moon behaved, and they turned it into a story so everyone could know how the sun and the moon work together for the benefit of the people. And Jim, if you'd like to take it over and explain where we're going now.
Thanks, Jim. So yeah, that was a really neat explanation of how different cultures can view the moon, and the differences amongst all the cultures are, totally different with each one. So that kind of wraps things up. I hope you guys enjoyed this. It's kind of fun to just take a little bit to explore the moon. A lot of times when we're trying to look at deep sky objects, we want it as dark as possible. And so when we're doing that, we don't always get a chance to look at the moon. But I actually enjoy, with a telescope, looking at a crescent moon up to about a first quarter moon. Because when you've got a crescent, if you look right along the day-night terminator, you're able to see a lot of the depth to the craters and the height to the mountains. And you can see small little peaks right in the middle of some of the larger craters that are caused when the meteor impact happens. And so you can see all that stuff in a telescope. So I encourage you, we have some virtual events on our Facebook page and our website and our YouTube channel, and we'll also probably be putting links to them on the website. But especially if we can get back into doing some in-person events, try to come to a moon viewing party where there's a nice crescent moon, or a star party when there's a nice crescent moon, and take the opportunity to really explore the craters and some of that kind of stuff. There's our website, our YouTube channel. We'll post this on our YouTube channel as well. It'll also be on our Facebook page under videos. So, if you found it interesting, you want to share it with some family and friends, they can watch it after the fact. That's fine. We are going to do another virtual star party in August. You probably saw, if you look under our videos on our Facebook page, you'll see that we have 2 of them sitting there. This will be the next one. It'll be August 15th at 8:30 Arizona time. That's when it gets dark here that time of year. It is weather dependent. So, although chances are the 2 telescopes we're going to use is Jim O'Connor, who's just gave you the story on the Navajo, and another one of our members who at that time will be in Minnesota and in Cleveland, respectively. So hopefully they'll have clear weather. But we'll base that, we've got an event, Facebook event out there. And so if you want to just follow that, that's the easiest way to do it, so that if we postpone it or change anything because of weather, we'll make sure we put it in there. So again, thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And until we meet again in the virtual world, we'll talk to you then. Thanks, everybody. Bye.